This is the Fifth Estate Winning Headlines, your media police post. In this segment, we summarize some of the headlines that you may have missed this morning, but we also take a look at the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country. Today is the 6th of April 2021, and I am 2J.
I am JM.
And I am Miss K. Again, in case you missed today's headlines, here they are. Daily Nation, Succession, why 2022 is a do or die. Standard, how to save the school calendar. And The Star, one Kenya's 2022 lineup headache. Before we go into these things, I think we'd like to take a segue for a little bit and discuss a little bit about our economy.
Yeah.
2J,
Yes.
what do you have to tell us?
I feel like these days I don't even glance at the headlines anymore. I've just resigned myself to the fact that I'm going to spend my days lecturing Kenyans. And at some point, I think we became a nation that exchanges ignorance on Twitter and calls it an intellectual debate.
That's right.
And this weekend was no exception, as Kenyans on Twitter and the media at large attempted to dissect the economy and debt and failed miserably. So today, I want to damage some ignorance.
Yes.
Am I allowed to say that without prof?
Absolutely.
All right.
Go for it.
I will only make 2 points. The first is about what debt actually is, and the second is to debunk the fears that both the West and our local quack economists have placed in our minds. To start with what debt is, we need to go back to Economics 101. So David Nde, please pick up your notebook. Very simply, to understand debt, we first have to understand what a deficit is. A country runs on a deficit when it spends more money on things like healthcare, infrastructure, education, salaries, and so on, than it brings in through things like taxes.
That's right.
So if we spend more money than what comes in, the government borrows to plug that gap. This is where debt is born. But what is critical to note is that national debt is not like a credit card. The debt won't be due at some surprise time that we cannot control. As long as the economy is functioning, debt can easily be managed.
Yep.
So the narrative right now is that Kenya is borrowing too much money from China, the IMF, whoever. But for the record, 50% of all debt in Kenya comes from domestic borrowing. That means that for every 10 shillings the government borrows, 5 shillings is borrowed at home.
Yes.
And domestic borrowing is generally considered to be safer and stable.
That's right.
So when thinking about national debt, we must always consider it through the lens of why it exists. And in the past 16 years, that is 2 administrations, our debt has been the result of many long-standing plans that the government put in place, such as education, electricity grid expansion, healthcare, economic stability, and so much more.
And these are plans from the 1970s.
Exactly. These are not new plans, mind you.
Yeah.
So we are very much getting value out of the money that we borrow. My second point is short, and it speaks to the lies from Western institutions and local frauds. I was quite surprised to find this out. Recently, the IMF admitted that they themselves have no evidence that any particular debt threshold is dangerous. This means that even the leading global economists have no idea what is right and what is wrong. We are living by old methods and expecting them to take us to new places.
Yes.
So if we're seriously, very seriously going to engage in conversation about national debt and what it means for the country, we need to do so from a place of competence.
Yep.
Not all debt is bad. And in this very specific case from this weekend, this is actually good debt. So to the media, local economists, and bored Kenyans on Twitter, sit on a pin and please go read a book in the meantime.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much, 2J, for breaking down the deficit myth and debunking it. I don't know what you have to say, Ms. K.
I really have nothing to say. I think that 2J said it so well. Anything I'd say would water down that gauntlet she's thrown out.
and so let me just add on. So I'd like to debunk these stale assumptions made by most Kenyans, again, as you've said, 2J, when it comes to debt.
Yes.
So according to your average Kenyan today, debt is a big bad wolf. Well, the fact of the matter is that is a myth. And those who hold this view subscribe to the outdated economic school of thought, which says that government should budget like a household. Now, according to this school of thought, the government is like a big, complicated family. Ordinarily, if a family wants to buy something, say a new television, it has to either make that money or make that money.
Yeah.
Similarly, if government wants to build a new railway, it needs to make that money by taxing its citizens. That's according to that school of thought.
Yeah.
But modern monetary theory argues that this way of thinking is too simplistic for the contemporary world.
Exactly.
So according to MMT, the government shouldn't worry about crafting perfectly balanced budgets. Instead, it should see spending and taxing as tools to modernize and advance economies.
Yes.
Okay.
So let me explain the science through an analogy, comparing these two economic models. Imagine two buckets. One stands for the government of Kenya, and the other one stands for Kenya's private sector and everybody in business. The water in these buckets represents the total money supply, where government taxing and spending moves the water back and forth between the two buckets.
Okay.
In the household budgeting model, where the government runs a balanced budget, every drop of water poured in spending must be pulled back in taxes. And as a result, this leaves no extra water in the private bucket.
What a life.
However, in model number 2, where the government runs a deficit, it uses its power as a sovereign borrower and as a currency issuer to pour a lot of water into the private bucket.
Yes.
Then, through the drip system, it withdraws some of it back in taxes, only some of it. And the result is more water in the bucket of the private sector of Kenyans in general.
Yeah.
Or accurately, more wealth in
the
the
economy.
economy. And in any case, Kenyans, let us be honest with ourselves.
Oh, yes.
Our way of life in our own households reflects that we collectively live beyond our means. According to the NCBA Bank report released just last month, a few days ago, before Easter,
Yeah.
Kenyans borrowed 1.2 billion shillings every single day
Wow.
on Fuliza and Mshwari loans last year. And that's just Fuliza and Mshwari.
Yeah.
Now, the total loans taken are equivalent to the amount spent on building the Mombasa-Nairobi standard gauge railway, plus enough balance to construct a significant part of the extension to Naivasha.
Wow.
1.2 billion shillings every day. So, dear Kenyans, please keep an open mind about debt. And as I will say for the umpteenth time on this topic, I can explain it to you, but I can't comprehend it for you.
Oh, I do like that.
And
And
it's so
true.
shocking. 1.2 billion
1.2
every single
billion.
day.
Yeah.
That's shocking. Kenyans, don't throw stones if you live in a glass house.
Ah,
I don't think
Precisely.
they realize they live in glass houses, but I think that one statement is true. It said that Parliament and I guess our government should be a reflection of the people, and I think that it truly is in this instance. We are all collectively living beyond our means. I'd like to take us back to the headlines today, and I'd like to deal with the Star today. It talks about a One Kenya Alliance and their headaches for their 2022 lineup. So the Star newspaper today says that the One Kenya Alliance is facing a tough challenge of picking its 2022 presidential lineup. The paper speculates that the alliance of Gideon Moi, Musalia Mudavadi, Kalonzo Musyoka, and Moses Wetangula could disintegrate over flag-bearer disputes. And we at the Foothold School of Government submit that the One Kenya Alliance is going nowhere. And we say this for 3 reasons. 1, it has no plan. 2, it has no presidential candidate. And according to the Star, it cannot even marshal the number required to garner a 50% plus 1 victory in the election.
Even 20, even 10%
Can't
plus
do
1.
it. Can't do it. And the One Alliance core principles should understand that politics is war. And to win, you must not respond to events. You must direct the events. If you force people to react to your initiatives, you are in control. But if you react to the initiatives of others, you are being controlled.
Yes.
The preppy boys of the One Africa Alliance are under the control of one William Ruto. They're reacting to Ruto's political moves. Ruto starts UDP, then Gideon Moi, Musalia Mudavadi, Kalonzo Musyoka, and Moses Wetangula set up the One Kenya Alliance. But the core principles of the One Kenya Alliance are not known to be the directors of the actions of others. They submit to the will of more dominant politicians. I think we call it this elite circulation, isn't that what
that's right.
calls it?
Yeah,
So there are a bunch of foxes dominated by one strong lion. In fact, I'll give you an example. Remember the push and pull in 2019 over the NASA presidential candidature? Kalonzo submitted his own nomination papers under Wiper. Wetangula told us that Raila fired blanks and Mudavadi owned NASA. But in spite of their tough talk, they all declared Raila the candidate. So if any member of One Kenya Alliance wants to win in Kenyan politics, they should break script and do something radical. Until then, this alliance is dead in the water.
Dead.
Oh,
we have a 3-part criteria that we use to break down the headlines for you. Ask
Yeah.
ourselves 3 questions. Is the headline topical or speculative, repetitive or groundbreaking and thoughtful, or just plain lazy?
I would say we toss the standard.
Okay. Well, no offense to parents and their
And
hustles
children, of
and
course,
their
yeah.
calendars.
I'm quite interested in the headline by the Daily Nation.
Succession, why 2022 is do or die? Well, I think that it's clickbait, and
It
for
is.
that reason alone, I will toss the star and give the winning headline to the Daily Nation. And now on to our final thought. But before we get there, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit the notification button and the like button.
Wow, lots of stuff. And now our final thought. Today is inspired by a book entitled The Trigger: Hunting the Assassin Who Brought the World to War, written by Tim Butcher. And this is based off the theme for this week, which is about famous assassinations. And so we start with this book. At around 10:45 on the morning of Sunday, 28th June 1914, in Sarajevo, Bosnia, Gavrilo Princip fired twice at point-blank range into the car carrying the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie Chotek. The first bullet hit Franz Ferdinand's uniform and into his neck. The second flew through the door of the car and was deflected into the abdomen of the Archduke's wife. The Archduke remained conscious for long enough to address his wife with words that would soon be reported across the world. He said, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." Unfortunately, within about an hour and a half, both of them were dead. So the assassination of Franz Ferdinand is widely regarded as the trigger, like the title, that caused the start of World War I. By killing the Archduke, the heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Gavrilo Princip started a cycle of events that would leave 15 million dead from fighting between 1914 and 1918. And it proved fatal for empires and a way of ruling that had held for centuries. So just some context. During the 19th century, rising nationalism swept through Europe, and people took more pride in country and culture as their desires to rid themselves of imperial rule increased. And this widespread nationalism is thought to be one of the other causes of the start of World War I. Just some more context as well. Bosnian Serbs are the largest Serb community outside of Serbia itself. But during this time, Bosnia was annexed by Austria-Hungary when Franz Ferdinand and his wife traveled to the capital in June of 1914. So when this man, Princip, shot and killed Ferdinand and his wife, Austria-Hungary was furious, and with Germany's support, they declared war on Serbia on July 28th. Within days, Germany declared war on Russia, which was Serbia's ally, and then they invaded France via Belgium, which then caused Britain to declare war on Germany. I'm sure you can understand there was a web of alliances.
Absolutely.
But the events that the assassination triggered were so monumental that the story of this young man, Princip, has been overshadowed by the weight of history. His motivations have been misunderstood, and his intentions have been smeared. So the author in this book has chosen to focus on the individual, this young man. And the book follows the footsteps of Gavrilo Princip and tells the story of a young man who changed the world forever. It focuses on the drama of the assassination and the outbreak of war by following Princip's journey to explain the real motivations behind his actions. I thought it was such an interesting way to look at the origins of World War I through the actions of this one man.
The best way, actually, I find, to understand world events is to look at them through the eyes of personalities. And a documentary here comes to mind on Netflix, and that's Hitler's Circle of Evil. And they look at World War II, they look at the rise of Hitler through his cronies and the people around him. That way you really understand not only the events, but also the men and women who shape those events. But back to the book. Here we have a deeply insightful text about history's most influential assassin, Gavrilo Princip, the man who pulled the seminal trigger that set in motion the First World War. And what I particularly appreciated about this book is the manner in which the author conjured up a vivid picture of Sarajevo, Bosnia, as Princip would have found it in the year 1907, and that's the year that he started schooling at about the age of 13. So let me paint that picture for you. In the year 1908, Bosnia was annexed by Austria-Hungary, as you mentioned, 2J, to become its new dominion. And that led to the Bosnian dispute, which we are told served as a dress rehearsal for the First World War.
Yeah.
Now, the backstory to this is that 3 decades prior, in the year 1878, as the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Bosnia fell under the occupation of the Austro-Hungarian Empire through the settlement agreed at the Congress of Berlin. But that agreement stated that Austro-Hungary would merely occupy. It would not annex, but occupy. You know, so it didn't have the right to colonize the territory.
Yeah.
But in that year, 1908, they decided to now colonize the territory of Bosnia. And now the reason that annexation became a major problem is that Europe at the time was a tinderbox. As you've said, 2J, you know, it was a web of alliances.
Yeah.
And if you touched just one part of the web, everything would come
fall apart.
collapsing. It
Yeah.
was a house of cards, as I'll mention in just a bit. So the balance of Europe, the balance of power in Europe at the time was as painstakingly and delicately constructed as a house of cards. It was tenuous, that's what the author says. And so for several months around the winter of 1908, Bosnia was the epicenter of a crucial international debate in which European statesmen struggled to deal with Vienna's unilateral violation of the treaty that they had agreed at Berlin. And some of the questions that they asked, one of the questions that they asked themselves is, if the annexation represented a diplomatic gain for Austria-Hungary, you know, which of the other great powers would have stomached that loss in terms of territory for them? And so for many months, the name of Bosnia, the layout of its borders, and the details of its administration occupied the attention of the greatest diplomats, from London to Rome to St. Petersburg to Berlin, all of them desperate to save face and restore order in this very delicate, precarious balance of peace in Europe. And so in the end, full-scale conflict, we are told, was diffused when Russia declined to offer military support to Serbia, eventually leading to Serbia's grudging acceptance of the annexation. By the spring of 1909, the Berlin Treaty had been amended, the annexation was complete, and the House of Cards still stood. That was the context. And so Princip, we are told, was just starting his second year of school when this crisis began, and it shaped him. And what he witnessed on the streets of the capital city was the impact of that annexation. Deeper entrenchment of Austro-Hungarian colonial rule, emergency powers that had been granted to imperial governors, new waves of non-Slav immigration from elsewhere in the Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, growing resentment amongst fellow Slavs who grumbled that advancement was being monopolized by foreigners, and so on and so forth. Just a great deal of chaos and resentment, which radicalized the youth like him, him and many others, to do what they did in 1914.
It's very interesting you touch on that part of radicalization, because it's true. He was just 19 years old when he did that fatal shooting of the heir of the empire. And I'd like to talk about the context of the book, what inspired the author and what he came about, what became his conclusions as he looked back at the whole story. So at the beginning of the book, the author tells a story. He says that he was a journalist for the Daily Telegraph, covering the 1994 siege of Sarajevo during the Bosnian War. When I read this book, as a student of history, you forget that modern history also happens. And in 1994, there was a very long and winding and very hurtful war that led to the independence of certain states, Bosnia-Herzegovina, those states. So one afternoon, he was walking through a part of the town where people laid out their meager possessions and sold them, when he noticed some people occasionally slipping away from the makeshift market to visit a stone building at the edge of a nearby cemetery. And that building was a chapel that served as the tomb of Gravilo Princip. And the people kept visiting it to use it as a toilet.
Goodness.
So this story, this fact that he came upon this, was the inspiration for the book. The author had to know why the people of Sarajevo were desecrating the tomb of what he knew from history was their national hero.
Yeah.
And at the end of the book, after going through the journey of discovering the man himself, the events around him, what radicalized him and what led him to that act of shooting, the assassination, the author looks at the entire story of Princip in perspective. He has traced the history and radicalization of the man, also looked at the history and context of the Slavic nations and the effect of the assassination on European history. And Princip had been referred to some as a hero, by others as a terrorist, but the essential idea he stood for, the dream of liberation, he realized was a dream that was shared by nationalists and revolutionaries across the world. Whether by Irish nationalists struggling for home rule or Russian revolutionaries plotting against the Tsar. And the violence to which he resorted was no different from that employed by freedom fighters the world over.
Yeah, that's right.
But for me, the author's most important thing is the parting shot he gives. It's the most moving thing. He says, and I quote, "The concept of nationalism carries with it a reductionist edge. The sense that in seeking to define those who belong to a nation, others who do not belong can become a threat, an enemy to be confronted." And I think this statement serves as a warning to multi-ethnic communities such as ours. According to the author, Princip would have been appalled by the Bosnia War in the early 1990s, the one that took the author there. But the utopian dream that Princip had, the dream of Southern Slav nations being united, had failed. And that was the evidence of that war. Princip's message of unification had been distorted and he could be vilified. Later, at the end of the book, the author visited the chapel that started his journey one last time after the Bosnian War had ended. And the chapel had been restored and the filth had been cleaned up. And now that he had come full circle, the author tells us that the dominant impression he had on Princip was one of distortion. Everyone reinterpreted what Princip had done to serve their own interests, their own selfish and strategic ambitions. Well, I have to be honest that, as Winston Churchill once said, never waste a good crisis. I don't know if I can blame the powers that be for acting on that advice.
So true. And I think what was so interesting about this book is the author also talks about how most people look at World War I or what started it through like the economic or political lens, but very few people look at what was actually happening in all these European countries under various empires and all those kinds of situations. And I think that's what I most enjoyed about this book. It really brought the geopolitics into a different, into perspective.
I really like that. Today we had a winning headline from the Daily Nation, and I did mention this, but I think we chose by consensus a winning cartoon from the Star. And you should take a look at it. It's a caricature of one side has William RUTO, and in the middle you have an indecisive Raila Odinga looking at the One Kenya Alliance preppy boys and William RUTO. And the context, the quote here is, "In politics, there are no permanent friends or enemies." This is from William L. Clay, an African-American congressman, and it ends, "There are only permanent interests." I do like that cartoon. Allow me to leave you with a quote on assassinations from Voltaire. It says, and I quote, "An ideal form of government is democracy, tempered with a little assassination."
Oh gosh.
Do you have a great day?
No.